So much for joining me this evening for you all, beginning of your evening. I know during these times you're probably all zoomed out, so thank you so much for sacrificing your time. And I'm looking forward to this conversation, for our discussion, and for talking with you about this issue. So this is a new work, and it will soon be published with Hypatia. And so I'm pretty excited about that. So all the more because it's new, I'm so looking forward to your responses and your questions. All right. So traditionally, philosophers of forgiveness have primarily focused on providing necessary sufficient conditions for forgiveness, defending it as a moral idea or doubting its value altogether, like Daniel. However, some feminist philosophers have helped us to understand that forgiveness is gendered. Alice McLachlan and Catherine Norlock, for example, argue that forgiveness has traditionally been considered a gendered virtue, one that is regularly required of women and used as a tool for silencing assertive women. They both note how women have been socialized to be forgiven and often undergo social pressure to do so. Even our philosophical examples of forgiveness, they claim, are gendered. Forgivers X and M, or Jody and Sam, are usually men and colleagues who are independent and share in mutual advantages. However, when women appear, McLachlan and Norlock point out that those women are often abused wives or are said to practice a pseudo or inauthentic forgiveness that is likely to fail since it is not the real thing. These examples also rely on cultural tropes of women as helpless and not self-respecting. This diminishes their agency. For these reasons, McLachlan notes that, quote, feminists may have reasons to regard an ethics of forgiveness rather warily, end quote. I believe that feminist theorizing about forgiveness can inspire new ways of looking at forgiveness through a racial lens. And since McLachlan says that, quote, understanding forgiveness as a moral practice requires that we understand it as gendered among other things, it is my hope to show what other things forgiveness might be understood as. So my first aim in this talk then is to show how forgiveness can be understood as racialized. I'll begin by describing what is involved in racialized forgiveness, and I'll provide preliminary conditions of it. I'll also explain what I do not mean by the concept. My second aim is to highlight its moral dimensions. I provide additional reasons for when extending, withholding, and talking about forgiveness is morally objectionable, reasons that are grounded in race. I then go on to show that some of the moral ills that arise in the aftermath of wrongdoing is the consequence of our racializing forgiveness. I'll conclude by arguing that this gives us reasons to transform how we engage the practice. The practice of forgiveness involves taking on either of these roles as forgiver, withholder, advocate, or critic. And so to practice forgiveness differently involves taking on these roles with care, which includes revising our racial assumptions and aims, as well as refraining from and indulging in certain considerations. I'll also provide some recommendations. Okay, race and forgiveness. Let's begin by considering two examples. Paul has treated Jane unfairly. After he refuses to admit to any wrongdoing, Jane still decides to forgive him. And she does so because she thinks it is better to have less than more tension, since the latter makes her more stressful. Consider another example. Adam has spread an awful rumor about Philip. When Philip is made aware of this, he proclaims that he would never forgive Adam. By doing so, he believes he maintains a sense of self-respect and is praised for doing so. In both instances, feminist philosophers have described their forgiveness as gendered. This is because perhaps Jane feels more pressure to forgive because she is a woman, or When she forgives, her forgiveness is viewed as not the real thing, since she does not forgive for any moral reasons, but rather non-overriding prudential ones. The second example also shows how forgiveness can be viewed as gendered. If forgiveness is viewed as something that only women should do, Philip may decide to withhold forgiveness in order not to appear too weak, like a girl. Adam and Philip, two men, are depicted as both autonomous and have fairly equal standing, unlike Paul and Jane. However, if we look at these examples with only a gendered lens, we will miss other important things. Perhaps when the reader analyzes the first example, she imagines Paul and Jane as members of the same race. She may imagine that Philip and Adam are both white. Perhaps the reader doesn't see race at all. But how might an understanding of their racial identities influence how the reader in Paul, Jane, Philip, and Adam understand and practice forgiveness? How might we understand forgiveness when Jane is white and Paul is Black? Or when Adam is Arab and Philip is Filipino? Through a gendered lens, we might expect Jane's forgiveness and applaud Philip's choice to withhold forgiveness. However, I shall argue that through a racial lens, we may understand forgiveness differently. Jane's forgiveness may not be expected if Paul is Black, regardless of her gender. Philip's unforgiveness may not be applauded if he is Filipino. Philip may think he has additional reasons to forgive if he is Black and Adam is white, and he may feel social pressure to do so because of his race. The way that we account for this difference in understanding is by recognizing that forgiveness is not only gendered, it is racialized, such that if we change the racial identities of the characters or make their identities much more salient, the ways we understand forgiveness and practice it may also change. My aim is to provide an explanation for how and why this is the case, as well as the negative outcomes it is likely to generate. Cases that exemplify certain conditions, which I take as paradigmatic of the problem of racialized forgiveness, includes instances in which A, who is forgiven and not is overtly or tacitly determined by the race of the offender. B, praise and criticisms of forgiveness are determined by the race of the victim. And C, praise and criticisms of forgiveness are, at least implicitly, racially self-serving. Now, this is in no way an exhaustive list. I'm only focused here on these conditions. So racialized forgiveness describes how race, that is, racial goals, stereotypes, and implicit and explicit racial biases informs the practice of forgiveness in significant ways, such that it affects our engagement with it, as well as produce negative outcomes, including, but not limited to racial disrespect, paternalism, and the reification of racial hierarchies. When using the phrase determined, I'm only referring to the following: when race is morally irrelevant, but is yet given a primary consideration that it does not deserve. Therefore, when a potential forgiver, overtly or tacitly, decides to withhold forgiveness and race becomes a primary consideration, one that overrides other morally relevant ones, we can say that her race or her forgiveness is determined by race. And we can therefore describe her as participating in an instance of racialized forgiveness. Further, forgiveness can be determined by race even if someone is not consciously aware that race is playing such a role. This can particularly occur in cases in which implicit bias is informing their forgiveness. Let me briefly clarify racially self-serving in condition C. The practice of forgiveness can be racially self-serving when we praise or criticize forgiveness, one, as a form of racially grandstanding, in order to reinforce or obscure racial injustice, or 3, to promote counter resistance. That is to say, a person could criticize the forgiveness or unforgiveness of others as a way to showcase themselves as one of the wise whites, revolutionary Blacks, or angelic Asians in comparison to others who lack these features. They can also praise a person's forgiveness in ways that ignore systemic injustice or promote docility. What don't I mean by racialized forgiveness? In claiming that forgiveness is racialized, I do not mean that it is essentially so. We can imagine that before race was a concept, before modernity, there was no racialized forgiveness. Thus, to say that forgiveness is racialized is to only emphasize that the ways in which we practice it, that is, think of it, extend and withhold it, expect it from others, and talk about it, is racialized. Can forgiveness be racialized even when race is absent? Well, I do not think that race is ever absent. Just as forgiveness can be gendered in the case of Adam and Philip, that is, when both agents are of the same gender, since gender does not disappear when two men interact. Similarly, forgiveness can be racialized when both agents are of the same race, since race does not disappear when two white men, for example, interact. Forgiveness can therefore be analyzed as racialized in cases of white on white relations and Black on Black relations. But even in intraracial contexts, race can negatively influence how we practice forgiveness. If forgiveness is racialized, this does not mean that it cannot be other things. It can also be gendered. However, describing forgiveness as racialized can help us, for example, understand why a Black woman's forgiveness may be praised or criticized differently than an Asian woman's, and it would do so in ways in which a gendered analysis alone would be incomplete. Lastly, to say that forgiveness is racialized is not to say that those who practice it are racist. Race can inform our social practices without requiring that we hold any explicit negative beliefs, feelings, or intentions towards a racial group. Nevertheless, that is not to say that there are no morally objectionable dimensions. Okay, some cases and their moral problems. So let's return to the examples that began the first part of this talk in order to provide further explanation of the conditions as well as the moral problems with racialized forgiveness. Recall that condition A of racialized forgiveness is met when a person overtly or tacitly decides to forgive or withhold forgiveness because of the offender's race. Again, it can occur when Jane does not forgive Paul because he is Black. Instead of considering his remorse and apology, the wrongdoing's impact, or her own moral aims as decisive reasons to forgive or not, she instead, consciously or unconsciously, takes his race as a relevant factor in her decision. And this factor overrides other moral considerations. What might be at work here? How could race have such a weighty impact on her decision to withhold forgiveness? Perhaps she doesn't think Paul is worthy of forgiveness, since given certain racial stereotypes of his group as violent, aggressive, and beastly, she believes that the wrongdoing does indeed express the totality of his person. Perhaps it is because she has not spent much time with Blacks that counter these stereotypes. This may also lead her to think that he is not really remorseful or committed to not reoffending, no matter what evidence he presents. And this, she believes, lessens her reasons to forgive. In a moderate case, she might not be able to put her finger on why Paul isn't worthy of forgiveness. Perhaps it's a gut feeling. She is not aware of what is motivating the feeling that Paul is not worthy. This becomes an instance of racialized forgiveness when that feeling is grounded in latent views of Blacks as unworthy. Her feelings may never consciously affirm this. Further, and more explicitly, she might believe that her identity as white places her on a different tier within a racial hierarchy. His wrongdoing against her may be interpreted as more devastating and less forgivable, since by committing a wrongdoing against her, He violates not only moral norms, but racial ones. She may then decide to defend her status by withholding forgiveness. Given this racial hierarchy, she might also think that forgiveness in response to what she takes to be both a moral and a social violation may make her appear weak, not as a moral agent, but more importantly, as a white woman. She then may withhold forgiveness as a way to deny the wrongdoer's status as a racial equal and to communicate that she does not accept mistreatment from those who are less than her. She need not be a self-avowed racist to fulfill condition A. As research in implicit bias reveals, all of this can occur on the unconscious level. About races are the clearest cases, but of course, many of the most interesting cases we'll be concerned with will be more nuanced cases. Even about anti-racists can be exposed to these implicit or unconscious mechanisms. And these unconscious associations at work means race is determining forgiveness. This is not to say, however, that we will have no evidence of condition A being satisfied. It could be discovered, for example, through self-reflection or by the observation of critics. What moral failures does she commit? What are the negative impacts of her racialized forgiveness? By fulfilling condition A, Jane is engaging in an epistemic failure. By relying on stereotypes of Black, she is submitting to what Larry Bloom describes as, quote, false or misleading generalization of groups, end quote. She is also refusing to submit to counter evidence that Paul may be providing her, for example, reform attitudes and actions. But this is not just a cognitive error. Jane is also engaged in a moral one, and it has interpersonal impact. By relying on racial stereotypes of Paul to inform her decision, she is holding what Bloom calls a morally defective regard for persons. What is the negative impact of this? Bloom writes, cultural stereotypes involve a defective regard that is highly or widely shared, and that can therefore do a kind of damage to stereotype groups that goes beyond individual stereotyping. But individual stereotyping also involves an individual moral defective regard that can lead to individual mistreatment of the other. By having race as a determinant factor in her decision to forgive, Jane is failing to recognize Paul as an individual. And this failure to acknowledge him as such is a form of disrespect to Paul and his racial group. But note that, as Bloom writes, as groups stereotype one another, they fail to experience a sense of commonality, of mutual identification, for example, of a shared civic fate, or of common humanity, end quote. Bloom describes this as moral distancing. Jane's decision to withhold forgiveness is a signifier of this moral distancing. For in failing to forgive because of racial reasons, even if she is unconscious of them, she is not sharing in a common humanity with Paul. Jane can also be reifying a racial hierarchy by meeting condition A. Racial hierarchies are constructed rankings of value based on race. They are also lived out through social roles. That is to say, hierarchies are reinforced by the roles certain social identities are expected to take on. Examples are the American slave system and India's caste system, for example. What we expect from others and designate them to do and not do because of their racial identity reifies a racial hierarchy. While Paul, because of racial stereotypes, may be expected to be violent, he is not expected to be violent towards whites, at least according to Jane, given the hierarchy. And this may explain her decision to withhold forgiveness. It is possible to interpret her decision as being an issue of self-respect. We expect a self-respecting person to be indignant about wrongdoing done to them. And we may understand the decision to hold on to that anger given this self-respect. Philosophers have noted that wrongdoing communicates that I do not matter, but anger communicates that I do not accept that message. However, this is not all that could be happening in the hierarchy case. Jane could be responding not just out of self-respect, but out of racial superiority, although she may only consciously recognize the former. The wrongdoing in this case then does not only communicate that she doesn't matter. Moreover, it communicates for her that a person of color supposedly below her holds this view about her who is supposedly above him. This act and its cumulative force are therefore unforgivable. As a result, her racialized forgiveness can communicate a commitment to this hierarchy and reinforce it at the same time. So let's switch up identities in order to consider other ways condition A can be met. If Jane is Black, let's call her B Jane, and Paul is white, let's call him W Paul, the condition can still be met as long as her decision is determined by his race. What's at work in this case is different yet similar to the above example. Here, B Jane may explicitly withhold forgiveness from W Paul because his wrongdoing on her view represents the wrongdoings of his white ancestors. Since Jane is aware that whites once enslaved Africans and continue to historically mistreat them, she might think, without evidence, that his wrongdoing is a continuation of the wrongdoing that his white ancestors began. As a result, his wrongdoing may have a certain moral weight it would not have had if it was not connected to this ancestral past. And given such a wrongdoing, she withholds forgiveness. She might also see him through the lens of contemporary wrongdoings committed by other whites. With these two views together, ancestral and current ties, she might think that he is actually less remorseful or likely to repeat the wrongdoing, since it seems that white people can't be trusted. B. Jane's decision may seem understandable given US racial history. Her decision to view him as a representative of his race was often a survival strategy that many Blacks used in order to stay clear of the potential that all whites had to enact racial violence and mistreatment on them with impunity. Perhaps she is deciding to withhold forgiveness in order to survive. Her reasons need not be intentionally cruel here. However, in doing so, she is engaged in racialized forgiveness, and her practice is also morally objectionable. She, like the above case, is failing to see W. Paul as an individual when she sees him in his action as only an extension of his ancestors or necessarily tied to the wrongdoings of other whites. She has not given him recognition, respect. I've only referred to interracial cases so far. However, this is not to say that racialized forgiveness cannot occur in intraracial cases. As I previously noted, racialized forgiveness can occur in interracial cases since race does not disappear in such instances. For example, racialized forgiveness occurs in cases in which W. Jane forgives W. Paul because he is white. Again, instead of considering his remorse, the wrongdoing's impact, or her own moral aims as decisive reasons to forgive or not, she instead considers his race as a relevant factor in her decision. Just as we saw earlier, stereotypes can be working at the unconscious level. It can be determined in her decision to forgive. And this factor overrides other moral considerations. Perhaps she forgives Paul because she has implicit biases connected to his whiteness, which makes her interpret him as more innocent and less culpable. Just as there are negative stereotypes of Blacks, there are also positive stereotypes of whites. Whereas Blacks are viewed as stereotypically violent, whites are stereotypically good. Maybe Jane unconsciously sees white people as good, or perhaps she explicitly thinks this. And good people are deserving of second chances, according to Jane. She may also unconsciously accept the racial idea that when whites engage in wrongdoing, they have simply made a mistake. Whites, particularly white men, assume innate affective capacities, make it possible for her to imagine him as remorseful and repentant. Of course, she can overtly hold these beliefs, and this would be a conscious case of racialized forgiveness. There's also another conscious motivator that may be at work, although it may not seem morally worrisome. Jane might also intentionally see her forgiveness as a form of racial solidarity, a way of protecting a member of her race from the psychic and communal harm that she believes unforgiveness might create. This leads her to become sympathetic and forgiving. However, by allowing race to determine her forgiveness, W. Jane is disrespecting W. Paul and his racial group. Although she may be relying on positive racial stereotypes to inform her decision, such stereotyping still involves the bad of masking individuality, masking internal diversity, according to Bloom. She's failing to see W. Paul as an individual. When she thinks that by virtue of his race, he possesses certain moral qualities and thus warrants differential treatment, she displays what Kwame Anthony Appiah describes as, quote, a moral incapacity, the inability to extend our moral sentiments to all our fellow creatures, and a moral failing, the making of moral distinctions without moral differences, end quote. Her appeal to racial solidarity in this matter does not necessarily give her legitimate reasons to fail to take into account other moral and prudential considerations. Thus lies the instrumental bad. While there are always more risks involved in withholding and extending forgiveness, for example, a wrongdoer could repeat the wrongdoing or the apology may be insincere, by taking race as morally relevant, she is more at risk of compromising her safety and the safety of others due to her ill-founded racial confidence in him. She can also implicitly condone his moral actions as a result. Let's now turn to conditions B and C. Recall that racialized forgiveness is present in cases in which praise and criticisms of forgiveness are determined by the race of the victim. The practice of forgiveness is also racialized when such praise and criticisms are at least implicitly racially self-serving. And this occurs when praise or criticisms of forgiveness is used, 1, as a form of racial grandstanding, 2, in order to reinforce obscure racial injustice, or 3, to promote counter-resistance. So in what follows, I will provide some real-life examples of the following instances in order to highlight their moral features and effects. So consider the 2019 case of Amber Geiger and Brant Jean. I don't know if you all are familiar with this in the UK. When white Dallas, Texas police officer Amber Geiger was sentenced for killing Botham Jean, an African-American, as he sat in his home, his 18-year-old brother expressed forgiveness during his victim impact statement. He also hugged Geiger in court. And just to provide some context for those who may be unfamiliar with this case, they lived in the same apartment complex, but the white female police officer came home drunk and she tried to get into someone else's apartment that she thought was her own. When she entered the apartment, she entered the wrong apartment, but assumed that Geiger was robbing her apartment and she shot him to death. Okay. There were mixed reactions within the Black community. Some reactions that illustrate what I'm calling racialized forgiveness. First, some criticisms seem to be determined by the race of Jean's brother. For example, African-American writer Frederick Joseph wrote, quote, I respect forgiveness, but Botham Jean's brother just further bailed Amber Geiger out after the judicial system already did that for her. I think she got 10 years, I think. Joseph continued, Brant, continued a terrible precedent of Black people not holding white people accountable and that expectation being placed on the community. While empathizing with Brant's response, yet asserting her own, African-American journalist Christine Johnson noted, quote, sometimes it's easier to forgive, to let it all roll off your back like a duck, than it is to unpack and productively deal with the emotional and psychological trauma that comes with being a Black person navigating America. Miss me with that. I have the energy to be upset today, end quote. Recognizing these criticisms, Brant's mother wrote on social media, I'm proud of you, my son, Brant. Your load is lighter. Regardless of the views of the spectators, walk with God always. Forgiveness is for the forgiver, and it doesn't matter what the forgiven does with it, end quote. On one hand, Brant's forgiveness was seen as inauthentic. He was thought to have no overriding reasons to forgive Geyer. Being Christian and desiring healing were not viewed as sufficient reasons by some critics. His forgiveness was thought to not only lack self-respect, but respect for his brother. However, there was no supporting evidence to back up these claims. All that was made available was his forgiving utterance and action. It seems that the fact that he was Black and the wrongdoing was of a racial nature was all that was needed to conclude that his forgiveness was not the real thing. Instead of forgiven, he was viewed as unproductively dealing with his trauma and failing to hold his brother's killer accountable. What seems to be happening in this case is quite similar to Norlock's criticisms of gendered forgiveness. Recall, paradigmatic examples of forgiveness consist of individuals who are autonomous and self-interested, who act out of self-respect. When they forgive, they do it for moral reasons rather than prudential ones. Forgivers that do the opposite seldom count as engaging in the real thing. Norlock recognizes that women are often examples of practitioners of this pseudo-forgiveness. When Jane forgives Paul because she doesn't want the event to stress her out, even though Paul has not admitted to any wrongdoing, her forgiveness is described as inauthentic in the philosophy literature. This is an example of gendered forgiveness, according to Norlock. Likewise, the ways in which some criticize the forgiveness of others, particularly racial minorities, seem to follow a similar framework. Brandt is not viewed as self-respecting or autonomous simply because of his race. By criticizing him in this way, those who practice racialized forgiveness are denying him agency and failing to show him respect. The refusal to understand or attempt to see his actions as reasonable show their refusal to see him as a moral agent. Their unwarranted presumption of his docility and the equating of his forgiveness with bailing out also places an unfair social burden on him, a burden placed on top of his grief. Secondly, the satisfaction of condition C is also illustrated in this example. Johnson's criticisms can also be interpreted as an act of what I'm calling racial grandstanding. This is because the criticisms seem to serve the purpose of getting others to recognize her morality and to see her as having certain moral insights, racial priorities, and beliefs. Note the implicit contrast between Brandt and herself. Ease of forgiving versus productively dealing with trauma. Someone forgiving versus her refusal. And the energy she has to be angry versus the energy Brandt lacks. Unlike Brandt, she, as a Black person, is more productive, resistant, or affectively correct, or at least we can read her statement as such. And she wants others to recognize the ideal Blackness that she possesses. Critics, by racial grandstanding, show a lack of sympathy and sensitivity towards the victim. They also display a lack of moral awareness for what a victim experiences, and his reactions to it are not analogous to outsiders, regardless of what racial group they both belong to. The emotions, attitudes, and actions of the two are not on par. To make a character comparison to someone who is experiencing such a loss shows a lack of attunement to moral and factual features of the situation. One might then conclude, of course, she has more energy. Her relative was not killed by a cop while eating ice cream in his home. Now, this is not to say that our actions and attitudes do not have social meaning. Our actions can reinforce racial stereotypes and convey meanings, whether someone intends them or not. They have what Elizabeth Anderson and Richard Powers refer to as expressive meanings, meanings which are socially constructed, a result of the ways in which actions fit with or fail to fit with other meaningful norms and practices in the community. But it is not clear that these meanings will override other reasons to engage in a practice. Brandt may have been aware of the social meanings his forgiveness would have, yet he believed self-healing was an overriding reason, and so he forgave. What he should or should not have done, in light of these meanings, is not my focus here. What is important to note for our purposes is when others criticize him in ways that illustrate racial grandstanding, They are engaged in the practice of racialized forgiveness. Condition C is also met when a person's forgiveness is misused to reinforce racial injustice. We can see this in other reactions to the Geyer and Jean case, reactions that drew attention to this misuse. For example, civil rights lawyer Cornell Brooks noted that, quote, "The danger, however, here is that the forgiveness of Black folks is used as a permission slip for police brutality, permission slip for racial profiling, and permission slip for racial disparities." He adds, "I never imagined the capacity of Black folks to forgive would be misused as a benediction for police brutality. I preached forgiveness for 25 years, but using the willingness of Black people to forgive as an excuse to further victimize Black people is sinful," end quote. Recognizing the racial meaning Brandt's forgiven actions might have for many Americans, Bernice King, daughter of Martin Luther King Jr., responded, quote, "But don't confuse his forgiveness with absolving this nation for its gross, bitter discrimination against Black people and a myriad of systems and policies. Racism and white supremacy ideology can't be hugged out," end quote. When a person's forgiveness is interpreted as an excuse for racial oppression or absolution for the nation's wrongdoing, we have an instance of racialized forgiveness. Philosophical discourse can also satisfy condition C. This occurred through philosophers' standard use of racial minorities, such as Brandt and others, as forgiveness exemplars. By valorizing forgiveness or attitudes that are involved in the practice, they can implicitly deter minorities from engaging in affective forms of resistance. This doesn't mean that we should never use moral exemplars. They are important, since through them we are morally educated and inspired to be better. In the domain of forgiveness, the exemplars can remind us of how we can better respond to wrongdoing. They demonstrate us the possibility of forgiving the unforgivable, since they are proof that forgiveness is possible. Forgiveness exemplars can also give us hope and even motivate us to be less vengeful or angry. However, if I were to ask you to name an exemplar of forgiveness, I wonder who would come to mind. Norlock notes that the paradigmatic examples of forgiveness used by philosophers involve white men who are autonomous, self-interested, and in fairly equal positions of power. However, it is interesting to note that the real-life exemplars of forgiveness often used by philosophers are overwhelmingly Black and brown men and women who have experienced racial and colonial oppression. They include Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King Jr., and more recently, the families of the Charleston Nine. Glenn Pettigrew, for example, lists Gandhi, King, and Mandela as exemplars of what he called gracious forgiveness. Their forgiveness was gracious insofar as they forgave before the wrongdoer acknowledged the wrongdoing. Martha Nussbaum notes that the families of the Charleston Nine displayed attitudes very close to the love and generosity that she believes plays an important role in intimate relationships and revolutionary justice. The Charleston Nine were 9 African-American members of Emmanuel African Methodist Church who were gunned down by white supremacist Dylann Roof after they welcomed him to Bible study one evening in 2015. Their family members were acknowledged for their willingness to forgive Roof during his indictment. Nussbaum offers the following analysis. There is, however, a version of unconditional forgiveness that lies very close to unconditional love and generosity, lacking any nuance of superiority or vindictiveness. This sort of unconditional forgiveness was remarkably displayed by the survivors of the racially motivated shooting in the Charleston, South Carolina church on June 17, 2015. Invited by the judge in charge of the bond hearing to make statements on behalf of each victim, family members addressed the defendant, Dylann Roof, who has confessed. Most uncommonly in so-called victim impact statements, they did not express any vindictiveness or payback wish, nor did they express anger, except in one case to admit it as a defect. "I'm a work in progress and acknowledge that I'm very angry," says one family member. But universally, while expressing profound grief, they offered Roof forgiveness, wished for God's mercy, and insisted that love is stronger than hate. "She taught me that we are the family that love built. No concrete transition is envisaged, and the only future mention is one of God's mercy at the final judgment. Perhaps the situation offers little room for the transition, and yet there is something transitional in its spirit and the idea that love will prevail over hate and that a world can be reconstructed by love. Later, she lists Gandhi and Mandela as exemplars of love and generosity. While using exemplars is not morally worrisome, what is said and not said in their utilization is indicative of racialized forgiveness. Particularly, what gets ignored as we use these exemplars is revealing. Pettigrew admits that our admiration for these exemplars stems from the difficulty of forgiving in such dramatic situations, and these are his words. Citing Aristotle, he notes that these are situations that strain human nature to the breaking point. And this here, he cites Aristotle. Although Aristotle's words provide a more detailed description of what the forgivers experience than Pettigrew's dramatic situations, and is what we perhaps admire, he still ignores in explicit terms what their forgiveness was a response to, that is, white domination and supremacy. And he ignores the afterlife of the racial wrongdoing, which forgivers may carry after they forgive. Nussbaum lays out the details of the family's forgiveness that was offered up in the courtroom. But this description is also too simplistic. It constructs a love triumphs over hate narrative as if transitions of this kind are actually this neat. My worry is simple. While racial minorities are popular exemplars of forgiveness, what they actually forgave is often under-described. This risks obscuring the racial violence to which their forgiveness was a response. Exemplar talk can also be an instance of racialized forgiveness when justified suspicions around racial exemplar usage are not addressed, thus hinting, I bet implicitly, at its racially subservient nature. For example, using racial minorities as exemplars of forgiveness can communicate to minorities that forgiveness is the only acceptable way to respond to oppression, since its constant usage implies that it is what the white normative gaze admires. It is not surprising that racial minorities may then have reason to be suspicious of such usage. To not acknowledge this or revise how we use these exemplars may at best make the usage ineffective to some audiences, and at worst, communicate counter resistance. In another work, I describe this suspicion as follows. I am concerned about what can be inferred through their use. I'm afraid that most people who are the target of Nussbaum's argument, political resistors, are also racialized minorities who have been told by society to respond to racial oppression with positive dispositions like love and generosity. The lack of diverse examples, and not simply the argument, may then make them resistant to conclusions like Nussbaum's. Continual oppression and societal norms as they relate to emotions have created a context of distrust on the part of oppressed groups. Adding arguments on top of this context without addressing the history, the suspicion, and what's at stake when we argue for love, and we can add forgiveness, with Black and brown people as our favorite examples, can create more problems than it solves. I'm in no way claiming that I know the motivations of philosophers. What I am claiming is that when we use racial minorities as forgiveness exemplars in ways that obscure state-authored or racial violence, and are not attuned to the docile message it can promote to racial minorities, we risk engaging in a practice that is at least implicitly racially self-serving. Okay, so transforming the practice. I have argued that the practice of forgiveness is racialized when who is and is not forgiven and whose forgiveness we praise and criticize are determined by race. It is also racialized when we criticize or praise forgiveness in ways that are at least implicitly racially self-serving. Given its features and impacts, I've claimed that racialized forgiveness is morally objectionable. If all of this is tenable, then what should we do in response? So in this concluding part of the talk, I want to provide some brief suggestions. One of the proposals offered by both Nerlock and McLaughlin in response to gender forgiveness is to conceive of forgiveness as multidimensional or as forgiveness, respectively. For McLaughlin, this entails conceiving of forgiveness, quote, a set of non-hostile practices for negotiating wrongdoing that may express a number of reparative aims, relief, release, or reconciliation. In other words, forgiveness is not a singular idea, There are a variety of ways in which people can forgive and express forgiveness. By doing so, Norlock and McLaughlin aim to show that forgiveness does not look like one thing. One of the upshots of their proposals is that it allows women's forgiveness to be seen as forgiveness rather than a pseudo-forgiveness that lacks self-respect. The idea that forgiveness is racialized also provides additional reasons for us to theorize multi-dimensional forms. Consequently, this will expand the kinds of exemplars of forgiveness we make use of, since forswearing anger will not be the only non-hostile practice that qualify as forgiveness. Thus, we would not be limited to only non-angry exemplars. This would allow for alternative models of forgiveness. For example, those who retained yet moderated their outlaw emotions, and may then lessen the suspicion that I argue exists in current racial exemplar usage. Multidimensional forms of forgiveness would also help curb the tendency to quickly criticize racial minorities' forgiveness, since the decision to forgive will not necessarily hedge on matters of conscience self-respect. Rather, it would include non-individualistic as well as prudential conceptions, considerations, and values. Non-ideal forms will also help us resist creating neat forgiveness triumphs over hate narratives, which is likely to risk obscuring wrongdoing and its afterlife. That is to say, forgiveness may not get us ideal goals such as reconciliation. Hate may still exist and reign despite our forgiven stance. Even though forgiveness may result in moral repair, like any kind of repair, things may never be what they once were before the wrongdoing. They may even be worse. We can also begin to resist certain practices and create new ones. When using forgiveness exemplars, we can make sure to emphasize the racial violence and mistreatment that sparked the forgiveness of racial minorities. We can highlight that given this mistreatment and evidence of its continuation, that some have not forgiven, yet there are reasons for why that is okay too. We can also resist allowing race to inform us in negative ways. This can also occur by reflecting on if and how our racial biases impact who we decide to forgive and then remedy them. We can also resist allowing a person's forgiveness to represent their racial group by understanding its microaggressive nature and by being proactive in lessening the social pressure we put on others to forgive. Even when we disagree with people's decisions to forgive or withhold forgiveness, particularly in response to race-based violence and in interracial cases, we should be careful not to ascribe to them attitudes, for example, lacking self-respect, or actions, for example, letting someone off the hook, that are not grounded in evidence. We should, as a default, grant them agency and respect. Creating new practices may also require us to acknowledge social meanings of forgiveness and redefine them. For example, if the racial meaning of Blacks' forgiveness communicates continual permission to enact violence, a person can contradict this meaning and express new ones, just as Bernice King and Cornell Brooks illustrate. As members of the moral community, we should also extend sympathy towards victims. Even when we think there is a lot at stake, particularly in instances of high-profile race-based violence, there is no excuse for failing in our moral obligation to those who are the direct victims of wrongdoing. While it may be easier to engage in racial grandstanding, cultivating and extending empathy and sympathy, compassion and support is more fitting and productive. In a non-ideal world, wrongdoing is inevitable. While we may be limited in controlling when wrongdoing occurs, we can control how we respond. But this is not the sole responsibility of victims. We all engage the practice of forgiveness when we forgive, withhold forgiveness, and praise and criticize forgivers and withholders. I have attempted to show how race can negatively influence these practices with the hope that we can begin to see what so many before were unable